a little bit nervous here talking. Knowing the history of blacks, how they being supported by the Republican Party in the 1800s, and knowing all that, how did the script get flipped over? I mean, ever since I've been a little kid, I mean, it's always, blacks has always been, for the most part, always voted Democrat. Like my mama voted Democrat, my grandma voted Democrat and all that. And basically, that's been my other question is, how can we, I mean, I'd be happy before I leave this world that at least get 50% of blacks to vote Republican, or vote conservative. I look at myself as conservative more as a Republican. But basically, how did it get switched over to mostly being, voting Democrats, knowing that the history, how they were, violent against blacks? So.
That's the golden question.
I think we all, and I wouldn't mind if even each one of them on this panel kind of took a stab at that, even if it's very briefly and saying the same thing, because that is, the golden question. I know, and it's going to be several things. I mean, as far as I'm going to take it from, you said you would be happy if when you died, that at least 50% were voting their values, is what I call it, because it's not necessarily, you may have all of your values may line up with one party or another, but as long as you're voting your values, then you're golden. You know what I mean? And that's one of the things with the Frederick Douglass Foundation. Not necessarily to plug us, but that's what it is we want to hold more and more of these events because it's about education. You can't be empowered if you don't know these facts from a long time ago, and then to connect the dots all the way up to now. But one of the things that you see, who's in charge of our education system now? And how long have they been in charge of our education system? You saw it wasn't until around the 40s and 50s when you really started seeing blacks no longer voting Republican, conservative, that's where a majority, in this video, when we go on, we're going to see that he goes in depth into a lot of that information, okay? But the education system, we're taught things, you're not taught this information, okay? Because of whoever's in charge of that education system in history is going to tell you whatever they want you to know. And if you're told something long enough, just like if you're told that you're stupid long enough, you're going to start believing it. And we have generations and generations of people that have been told one thing, and it's not until you're able, I don't know what your background is, but it's not until somebody introduces something to you that makes you go, wait a second, where did that come from? I didn't know that. And you're willing to explore that information that you can learn something beyond what's taught to you. If you're taught to love Hitler, you're going to love Hitler, okay? And I could say a lot more, but like I said, I would like each one of the people on the panel to answer it, so I'm sure you'll get a full picture of that, because that's a very long answer.
Well, I'll just give you a short one. The 3 main points. Okay, and I'm going to make it short. Number one, the Democratic Party has never, ever, ever passed the Civil Rights Act relative to the African American. And being that they know that, they try to take credit for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was pushed by Republicans but signed by Lyndon B. Johnson forcefully. And the reason why Martin Luther King was a registered Republican is because during the time of the Civil Rights Movement, the guys who sent the dogs and the people who kept people out of schools were the Democratic Party. So what happened after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Democrats placed in their platform in 1968 entitlement programs. They specifically stated that no longer do people on welfare have to be denied welfare because the father stays in the home. As a consequence, African Americans began to vote Democrat, mostly because this is where the money came from that was poured into the African American community. And the Republicans objectively said that if you do that, you're going to create a permanent underclass. They said this in 1968, the Republicans. The Democrats objected to it and said, you just don't like black people. And that's the only thing that black Americans been listening to since 1968. That Republicans don't like black people and the Democrats have given us the programs, which is why we have all of these fatherless homes, prisons full of black people, the graveyards full of babies who've been aborted or whatever, murders and stuff like that. We created a permanent underclass because programs have stifled the economic progress, and it leads to a psychological deficit when it comes to achieving something in society. The third thing is that the Democrats understood that they were the party of the segregation, the KKK and stuff like that, so therefore they tried to flip history. So in addition to not being able to have free speeches in the churches, the Democrats said, well, when President Nixon became president, he had a Southern strategy, which means that all the old Republicans are the new Democrats. This was a lie perpetrated by the Democratic Party. So now, black people are actually thinking that the abolitionists of the early 19th century are now the contemporary Democrats. Okay? So we have three issues that have really, really caused damage in the black American community. Those three planks right there: entitlement programs, misrepresentation of history, and what was the first one? They never, ever, ever passed a civil rights law relative to African Americans.
They know more about this than I do, but I have a theory that it stems back to the golden boy of the party of slavery, segregation, and KKK, John F. Kennedy. He passed a bill that enabled government workers to unionize, and when they did, they took over the teachers' unions and, all of the government unions. And obviously we all know that unions give money to the party of slavery, segregation, and the KKK. And that is where they perpetuate themselves, and obviously they teach young black children the history according to them. And that's, they perpetuate their own power. That's where the message got out that, Republicans hate black people and Democrats freedom from slavery, even though it's totally the opposite. And it really goes back to what Orwell said: he who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future. And it's all who gives the message.
I have to agree with everything, and I also want to share two things about my experience. I went to school in New York City. I'm a native New Yorker, and I went to school in Harlem in the 80s. And I'll give you a little bit. I'm of Cuban ancestry. My parents left Cuba in 1960 and lived in Venezuela for a while, and then my parents got divorced and I came back here. So I grew up in this neighborhood in New York City, in Queens, and I remember coming into Harlem and studying there and seeing how many bright and intelligent students, Africans, African Americans, and all that, and just reflecting back on that, just thinking that they had a mentality, and I did too, of victimization. The system victimized us. And you're looking back at history now and saying, where? Because when you're a victim, you don't have any opportunity to be creative. You're just looking to beat and survive. And keeping people under that constant state of fear and antagonism doesn't permit you to move on. And I see it 4 or 5 generations now when I talk to my students, and they concoct all kinds of stuff. And I'm like, who are you listening to? Well, who do they listen to? If they ever listen to the news or the music, or it's all distorted. And I'm just, where did this happen? And my parents had it right front and center. They left Cuba because they didn't want to be told what to do. or what to think. And when they came here, I remember just hearing, we're in the greatest country in the world. I was like, oh no, America, there's all kinds of problems here. We need to overthrow it. But I was just swept by just the emotion and seeing that really spent a lot of time just walking and thinking, where did this all come from? It all came from my schooling. I mean, lies and this and right, teachers have a lot of influence, and I have to say, I was a registered Democrat for years, and when I got married to a staunch Republican conservative, well, let me tell you, everything started flying in that house. And I would come up to him, and I'm being as honest as I can be, and he would say, well, can you tell me something about that? And those little comics on YouTube that they say, watch a liberal rant? I used to say, well, it's oppression, they're fascists. And he said, do you have any facts? And here I am, college educated. Do you have any facts? Yeah, because Johnson and Ronald Reagan, he was the worst. He really polarized people. So you know what my house looked like? Here he was, and my husband's a converted Republican from the time the Jimmy Carter switch, because he's a military, and he loves this country. And I was like, honey, I don't know where I was thinking. Where was I hanging out? He goes, yeah, with all those friends in New York City. And now I have evolved, okay? Rightfully so, going back to my roots. And now when I talk to my friends in New York City, I was like, oh my God. I have to cut them off. Because they're like ranting and raving. So, and overall, here's a person who's lived in the midst of that. If you say New York City, you're a conservative and you're a Republican, you can. You will probably, the KKK will come to your apartment house or something. There she goes, there she goes. So that's my little story. And I share that with my students. So they don't think I'm the only one who's like, because they often say, oh, miss, you're trying to be white, You Republicans, that's what they say. I had one student tell me, oh, you're one of those people. I love it. I said, yes, and I'm very proud. Or they say, oh, Republicans, they got all this bunch of money. I said, I know a lot of poor Republicans, very working class. That was it. That was my little rant in New York City.
Okay, well, quirky, considered, my family calls me quirky and weird because I'm Republican, and I have some friends who think I'm weird because I'm a black Republican, so it's strange being a minority within a minority, but I wasn't always Republican, I was Democrat, and so I actually understand how they look at me, so I don't, judge them or anything. I listen a lot, and I have a few debates here and there, but and I won my husband over, so that's good. So, but I'm one of those people who have to know the facts. I thought that, like he said, the parties have switched or something. I'm like, what happened? Because now the Republicans are the ones, and they're the racists, and all this stuff that the media feeds you, and so you kind of buy into it. And my parents are Democrat, and aunts and uncles, so I thought that. If you're black, you're supposed to vote Democrat, obviously, because the other side is racist and they're trying to, they're out to get you. So, but as I started researching and meeting other black conservatives and stuff and realizing that my views were flawed and a lot of my arguments just didn't hold up. And so I have to know things for myself. So I actually studied the platforms. This has really helped me understand, because I kept looking for the flip. I said, there got to be a flip in there somewhere in history. There's a flip. And there was no flip. I didn't find the flip. I looked at the platforms from the inception of the parties, from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and I read all the way through, and I noticed that the Republican platform is consistent in its message all the way through. I mean, they still have the same values. The Democratic Party flipped a little bit, so I was really interested in what he was saying around the Civil Rights time, right after the Civil Rights legislation passed, which Republicans passed it, signed by a Democratic president, that the Democratic Party really started going after the black vote, and they started really putting in their plank a lot of civil rights that they started building housing. We're going to build low housing projects for the poor people. We're going to attack these problems. And the Republicans said, if you do that, you're going to create a slum. You're going to actually trap these black people in these cities, in these slums. And what we want to do, if you want to combat racism, you have to integrate black people in all parts of government. We want them to be business owners. We want them to own businesses. We want them to be homeowners. We want to give them loans to buy homes, loans for businesses. And so they wanted to attack the poverty issue and the racism issue very different than just throwing money into the system. And the Democrats was all about the welfare system. We're gonna, if the mothers don't have to work, you can have, in 1968, they said the mother can stay at home with her kids and don't have to work. We're gonna take away the provision to make the young mothers work, and we're gonna take care of you and your kids, but you can't have the father in the home. So the black, that's where they say, hey, honey, you can't stay here. You can't live here, because now the government has become the father. Now that's how they're getting their income, and that's a really big problem in the black community with where the breakdown of the family started coming in. And so a lot of these problems came back right in that era. And so now these social programs are actually crippling. And like he said, the Republicans say you're going to create a permanent underclass of people. We don't see classes. We see people. You see classes. So now Democrats, a lot of people say, oh,